are there any particular memories that you have from school?
Oh, there's so many memories, but the best memories, of course, are the memories of seeing the happiness of all of the kids that have gone through the school. But in terms of other memories, I suppose the building of the college in 1983 would be a significant memory, and the opening of the school by Gemma Hussey, and the visit of President Herzog to the school in 1985 would be significant moments in the life of the school.
Okay. And we've also heard that there was a school fire.
Yes, there was. There was a school fire in 1981, and the only aspect of the school that is left or was left from that fire was the front facade of the building. And that front facade we kept.
Can you tell us about the founding of the school?
Yeah, I can. So there's two aspects to this. In 1920s, most of the Jewish community that had come to Ireland from places like Belarus, Lithuania, Poland, Russia, they all lived down near South Circular Road, and they all went to school in the local schools. So they would have went to Sing Street, they would have went to St. Catherine's, some of them went to Westland Row, others that could afford it went to St. Andrews. And what happened then was that there was a directive that there would be Saturday morning teaching, and the community obviously weren't happy that there would be Saturday morning teaching, and they got in touch with the Archbishop and they got in touch with the heads of the schools, who weren't really receptive to changing it. So the elders of the community at that time decided that the only way forward for them was to actually establish a school of their own. So in Bloomfield Avenue, on the corner of it, Stratford National School was established in 1934. And stayed there until it moved up onto the campus in Rathgar in 1980. The secondary school was established in just around 1953-54, and that was established because there were difficulties for Jewish students in getting into schools around Dublin. So a group of people in the community first of all used a house on Terenure Road East, but that wasn't really suitable. It was very noisy, didn't work, didn't have enough space. And a group of people led by Elaine Fellman went and they bought for 4,250 Irish punts the house in Zion Road that currently is where our complex is. What's interesting is that up until 1976 or 7, most of the children in the school were Jewish. So there would have been maybe 85% Jewish, 15% non-Jewish. And it became clear to the principal then, and also to the chief rabbi, who at that time was Rabbi David Rosen, that to build a school going forward, it wasn't possible to sustain it in that way. And it was agreed at that time that the school would be a school that admitted all faiths and none. And that's the way we are today. And I think that what Stratford has is a badge of tolerance, inclusion, warmth, welcoming, people feeling that it's a good place to be, where all religions can be side by side.
How has Stratford changed in the past 25 years?
Gosh, in so many different ways. The community has become more diverse, our school community, so there are people from all different nationalities. I think we counted 26 a few years ago. The curriculum has changed hugely, so the junior cycle would be a big part of that. Transition year is changing all the time, so we're trying to improve that all the time. We introduced computer studies or computer science into 5th and 6th year, and one of the first schools to do that, along with other core subjects like well-being and so on. So the curriculum has been a huge change. Staffing, lots of staff changes too. People have retired after long service and have been replaced by very worthwhile, very important successors. The facilities have changed, I think you'd agree with that, and improved. So we've now got what used to be the kindergarten as our art room. We have the old rabbi's offices, and there were 2 of those knocked into one, and it's the Herzog room. We've moved the art room around a few different times, but the English room is where it used to be for quite a while. The science lab has been put on, and the computer studies, there's a computer science lab. Both of those are only about 24, 25 years old. So there's been a lot of changes and improvements, I think, in the facilities around the school. COVID obviously made a big impact, and some of the changes came around because of COVID. So we've new toilet block, for example, that replaced my office, or that my office gave way to it. We have an outdoor gym now. We have lots of seating outside, which we never had before and hadn't really thought of before, which is incredible. We've new awnings and canopies, and using our outdoor spaces much more than we used to now, and in more imaginative ways, which is fantastic. Our enrolment has increased, so from 150 maybe 25 years ago up to 173 now, which is great for a small school. And our students have changed, and Sean, you reminded me of that. They're very different, their needs and their ambitions and their fears and their hopes and aspirations have all changed, and we've tried to keep up with those as well.
How does the school serve the Jewish community today?
Well, the Jewish community is very important because it is our founding, our patron community. But the old Dublin Jewish community has almost died out, and has, to all of our surprises, been replaced by a new demographic, a new Jewish demographic, who are made up of Israelis in the main, who are moving because of high-tech jobs. And that, to our amazement, has meant that our Jewish enrolment has increased, and we've all benefited from that. However, the new Jewish students come from families that aren't as religious as the older community used to be, and I think that's true of religion in Ireland generally. So we're trying to come to terms with that and understand what new Jewish families expect and want from a Jewish school. And we've moved, I think, more towards a legacy, and the legacy of our school and the heritage of our school, the roots that we have in Dublin Jewish life, rather than at the religious formation, which was much more important a few years ago.
And how has Stratford College impacted on you?
Well, I would always regard myself as being a steward, I suppose, of the legacy, a custodian of the legacy of the school. Enormously impressed and appreciative of those who've been involved in the governance of the school, and the commitment, their commitment in time and expertise has just been extraordinary. I think we're a special school, and anybody I know who's transferred into the school would say that, in comparison to the schools that they might have come from, that they can see the difference and feel the difference. Somebody the other day told me that he could feel that it was a well-ordered school, and that people were very respectful of each other, and he was only in for less than a day. So I regard all of that as being a privilege, and you know, one of the best things of my life and of my professional career, to be involved with and to be working for Stratford.
So Bertha, what are your memories of this street?
My memories are of many shops that were owned by Jewish people, from around about here all the way up the road. And on this side, the first one I remember was owned by a lady called Janie Goldwater, and she had a license just to sell chickens and hens. She wasn't a total butcher shop, but she did a great trade.
Had your family a connection with this street?
My family had a big connection with this street. In fact, in this area here, there was a kosher delicatessen, and this was owned by my uncle on my father's side. In the Jewish community, when I was growing up, there was a lot of cousins marrying cousins. So when I say that it was on one side or another side, you'll understand. So this shop was full of the most beautiful smells: smoked salmon, pickled cucumbers, everything you could imagine. Nothing was packaged. It was all in big sacks, which is the way we're going back to now, that we're not using plastics. And you would go in there and find anything you want, from sweet to savoury. Open 6 days a week, and Sunday was the big day for the bagels and the smoked salmon. That was in this shop here. This building was owned by two brothers, the Waltzman brothers, and that was a kosher butcher shop. They were strong rivals of my grandparents' and my parents' shop, which we'll see later down the road. They were very famous for making the best wurst, which is a salami, and sausages. But we always said they weren't the best, that my families were the best.
So Bertha, tell me about the history behind this building.
Well, we're now off the main street, which was Cumbrassel Street, and we're now in Lombard Street West. This house here was actually a shop owned by a lady, Mrs. Rick. Mrs. Rick was a small lady who used to sit out in this porch to catch the sun. She sat here whenever the sun came out, and she was a beautiful golden colour from the sun. In the front of the shop, she had all the sweets that you could imagine, all in big glass jars. But behind, and it's a very small house, she brought up all her children. Again, she was a widowed lady, so she brought up 6 children in this house, as well as running a sweet shop.
We're now on Lower Cumbrassel Street, which is now Islamic Relief. What was it once?
This building here was owned by my great-grandfather, who emigrated from Latvia, Lithuania, Russia, nobody knows exactly where from, in the late 1800s. The name over the door was always M. Rubenstein. His name was Meyer Rubenstein. This name was left on the door until quite recently, when it was taken over. And even though my grandparents and my parents subsequently owned it, it still had the name M. Rubenstein over the top. This was a butcher shop, yet another butcher shop, probably one of the biggest in Cumbrassel Street. And my memories of it go back to when I was a very, very small child, when I was brought down here on a Sunday morning, because my mum also worked here with my dad, and of course they couldn't find babysitters. So this is where I spent my Sundays as a child. People used to come in and get samples of wurst, pickled meat, whatever they wanted. They were given it free as a tasting on a Sunday morning, mostly to the children. It was a good sales technique, because then the adults bought it. Strangely, across the road, there was another butcher shop called P. Rubenstein, which was my grandfather's brother. This gentleman actually owned a non-kosher butcher shop around the corner. And as a religious Jewish person, he felt very bad about selling non-kosher meat. So my grandfather set him up in a shop right opposite him as his rival, something I don't think you would see today. They fell out from time to time, but in most cases they were harmonious and they all had their own customers. There's one more shop that we're going to go to now, which actually was the last kosher butcher shop in existence, and that was called Béla Erlach's.
So Bertha, you mentioned this was the last kosher butcher shop. Tell me a bit about it.
This shop was called Erlach's, and the lady who owned it was Béla Erlach, but prior to her, her father owned it, when he died, she was a single lady and she took over running the shop. Mr. Ehrlich, we always called Old Man Ehrlich. I don't know why. He was probably a lot younger than I am, but he certainly looked a lot older. Both Old Man Ehrlich and Bela were heavy smokers. And in those days, you were allowed smoke while you were preparing the sausages and selling the meat. And any photos you'll see of Mr. Ehrlich or Bela Ehrlich is with a cigarette in their mouth. But she was the last man standing, or the last woman standing.
We're outside the old Greenfield Hall synagogue with Irish Jewish historian Dr. Natalie Wynne. So tell us a little bit about the history of the synagogue.
So the United Hebrew Congregation was launched in 1908. It was a venture that was intended to unite the immigrant Jewish community in Dublin, which had split into a number of small independent congregations from the 1880s onwards. It was intended to, as a demonstration to the rest of the Jewish community in the outside world of how far the immigrant community had progressed in a short time since their arrival in Dublin, that they were able to come together and to fund the building of a modern synagogue building such as this beautiful neoclassical building that we have here. The project started off with great buzz and great excitement and enthusiasm, and people were really optimistic about what they would be able to achieve by working together as a group. But unfortunately, it wasn't able to maintain its momentum. It took a number of years to identify the suitable site here in South Circular Road, because they wanted somewhere that would be centrally located and convenient for the immigrant community. And then once they had raised the funds and were prepared to start building, they had the outbreak of the Great War, and there were shortages in materials and personnel, so that it caused a number of delays, and the project wasn't completed in the end until 1924. The synagogue was consecrated by Rabbi Isaac Herzog in 1925 eventually.
The Breslau Bakery with Irish Jewish historian Dr. Natalie Wynne. So I believe that you have a family connection with the bakery. Would you like to tell us about this?
That's right. In the 1920s, my great-grandparents Solomon and Malka Klein ran the bakery, and it was known as Klein's in those days. So I believe it was Malka who actually ran the business, and it was not uncommon at the time for women to be involved in a family business, and their contribution to the family economy was very important, and it's been underrated because their work tended to be invisible in the home or in a family business. So it's important to give it recognition.
So tell us, how important was this bakery in Irish Jewish life of the past?
So like all of the Jewish shops in the area, the bakery would have been a hub. Like it had a social function as well as just being a place where people came to get food, and people also, because in the days before fridges and freezers, had to go shopping a lot more often, but shops provided a place where people could meet and socialise and exchange news and gossip. It would also have created a sense of familiarity for people, familiar foods that kind of reminded them of home. And probably helped to ease their adjustment to living in a new country and a different place.
We are outside the building that used to be Lennox Street Synagogue with Saul Wilson of Jewish Arts and Culture Ireland. What are your memories of this synagogue?
Well, the synagogue itself was established, records tell us, in 1887, but my memories start around 1966 or 67 when I was 5 and 6 years old, when I first started coming here with my father and my grandfather. By the time I started coming here, my grandfather, Willie Wolfson, had been president of the synagogue since 1945, and it was known colloquially as the Wolfson Synagogue. My memories are that It only opened on High Holy Days, which would be Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So small was its congregation. At its peak in the late 1890s, it had 176 members, but by the time of the 1962-63, it only had 50 members. I remember some of the characters who conducted the service and who were part of the service. Dr. Teller, who was a great academic, Albert Lindy, Petal Green, my Uncle Louis, my father, my grandfather. And my grandfather used to sit in the box because he was the president of the synagogue.
And do you know what happened to the synagogue?
I do indeed. Because of my family connection, what happened was the numbers dwindled so low. It was one of those small synagogues originally established as a chevra. But by the early 70s, when my grandfather, the president, Willie Wolfson, died, the community of Lennox Street had dwindled so small, but there were still a few men who really needed a place to go for a service. What they did was, and this is a very nice closing of the loop with what we're doing here today, they moved the synagogue. This building closed as a synagogue in 1973, and they moved the synagogue for the High Holy Day services to the front room in Stratford College, your school, where the services were conducted from 1973 until 1982. And I remember being in that front room after I'd done my bar mitzvah, and for a few years afterwards, where there were 11 or 12 men and 2 or 3 Stratford students who conducted and participated in the service.
We are here at the Irish Jewish Museum with Hilary Abrahamson of the Irish Jewish Committee, a committee member of this museum. Ms. Abrahamson, what does the Jewish Museum tell us about past Jewish life?
Well, in this museum, which was originally a synagogue, downstairs you have the whole social history of when Jews came to Ireland and what they did. And then upstairs we have the synagogue. The first mention of anything Jewish is in 1079. There's something called the Annals of Inishfallen. And Inishfallen is an island off the coast of Kerry. And there's a monastery there. And in the Annals it says, 1079, 5 Jews came over the sea bearing gifts for King Turlach O'Brien. And King Turlach O'Brien was the king of Munster. And it's interesting to know that the cemetery in Ballybock, the old cemetery in Ballybock, the sea used to come over the wall and wash away the graves. And so they built a wall around, and Bevis Marks, which is one of the really big, very old synagogues in London, paid for the building of the wall around the cemetery in Ballybock. In 1881, there were 474 Jews in the whole of Ireland. In 1891, there were almost 1,800 Jews. So that's quite an expansion. What had happened was, in Eastern Europe, the Jews were having a really bad time. Boys from the age of 12 could be conscripted into the Russian army. So many people would make their child lame, blind, damage an arm, just to keep them from having to go into the army. Because if you went into the army, it wasn't for 5 or 10 years, it was for 20 or 30 years. And because these boys were so young, they were sent to the front, and you probably never saw your child again. And so that's why many people left. The people who were here in the 1800s were mainly from France, Austro-Hungary, Germany, some from England as well. And they were what was known as the settled community. And they built a beautiful synagogue in Adelaide Road.
We are outside number 37 Adelaide Road. This used to be a synagogue. We are here with Saul Wilson of Jewish Arts and Culture Ireland. Would you like to share some of your memories of the time when this was Adelaide Road Synagogue?
I would indeed. When the Lennox Street Synagogue dwindled in size and was only holding services a couple of times a year, my family moved to this synagogue. So I was going here from a very early age until it closed. I did my bar mitzvah here, my brother David did his bar mitzvah here, and my sister Rachel did her bat mitzvah here. My memories of the synagogue are very much tied up with its beauty inside. As you can see from the outside, it's a very, very ornate and beautiful building, and the decor inside was very intricate with some lovely features. My other overriding memory of the synagogue is the synagogue prided itself on its wonderful cantorial singing and its choir. It had a permanent choir, and it had a cantor called Reverend Halpert, who was of Eastern European extraction, and he had the most achingly emotional, beautiful cantorial voice. And there was a choir that had some really, really wonderful singers in it. And for my sins, and even though I couldn't sing, somehow or other, because I could read Hebrew quite well, I was put in the choir. And I remember the first pay packet I ever got in my life. Believe it or not, you actually got paid for being in the choir. And we used to rehearse downstairs during the week on a weeknight for the choir in the Leslie Golding Hall, and then on Saturday mornings we would sing in the choir. So the first pay packet I ever got in my life was for choir duty. So I remember that. There were some wonderful voices. The choir master was Izzy Bernstein. He had a brother, I think, called Max. There was a wonderful bellowing, booming singer called Joey Morrison, and there was a classmate of mine called Carl Nelkin.
How has this area changed?
Well, from being back at the turn of the century and right through to the 1920s, 30s and even into the 50s, it's interesting how the demographic has changed. If you walk down Clonbrassil Street and up around South Circular Road where the mosque is now, and down on Clonbrassil Street where you see halal meat shops, Islamic Relief, you notice the demographic is still immigrant, but the content of it has changed, and that's from a historical and migration point of view is quite interesting.